This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really excited to get to speak with some of the editors from the journal In Geveb about starting a journal, working on a journal. I'm going to briefly introduce the folks that we're talking to today. This includes Sarah Ellen Zarrow, who is Associate Professor of History at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington, where she also holds the Endowed Professorship in Jewish History. Sarah is on the peer review team of In Geveb, and Dalia Wolfson holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and is currently a PhD candidate in comparative literature at Harvard. She is the managing editor of text and translation of the journal, and Jessica Kirzane is the Associate Instructional Professor of Yiddish at the University of Chicago. She teaches all levels of Yiddish and coordinates the Yiddish language program at the University of Chicago, including curricular design and assessment development. And Jessica was the pedagogy editor at the journal, and since 2018, she has served as the editor-in-chief of the journal. And Saul Noam Zaritt is an assistant professor at The Ohio State University. He is currently a member of the journal's editorial board and has served as founding editor-in-chief and peer review editor. So these were very brief bios. You guys have all published so much, of course, also, and that might come up in our conversation. But for now, I wonder if you can tell us about why and when this journal was founded.
So in the early 2000s, there was really only one Journal of Yiddish Studies, Chuliot, out of Israel. And it soon closed when its editor, I think, passed away. And so there was just a void of there not being a journal dedicated entirely to Yiddish studies. And David Ruskies had always had this idea to do that, to reignite either something from YIVO's past journals or to somehow inspire someone to do something. And he was interested in it becoming, David Ruski is a professor of Yiddish literature at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And he wanted it to be a newer kind of journal. He wanted it to be kind of digital or online journal. And he himself felt, as a member of a certain older generation, that it wasn't the kind of thing that he could take on. And so he went out searching over a number of years in the early 2010s, looking for someone or scholars or technology people that could collaborate and take it on. And eventually he, in this sort of way, thought that he could choose the person himself. And he talked to Eitan Kensky, who's currently the librarian, the Judaica librarian at Stanford, and Eitan talked to me as someone he also knew, and the two of us then approached. There was a funding opportunity involved, and the two of us got this idea from David, and he really wanted it to be a more traditional journal with maybe an option to post a few PDFs if you needed to. People that had stores and stores of photocopied material that they wanted to digitize. But Eitan and I were both children of the blogging generation of LiveJournal and all of that. And we wanted to rethink what a journal could be online and what that might mean. Because there was going to be a funding opportunity through the Naomi Foundation, the Naomi Kadar Foundation, that we really could, we had a sort of open chance to try really something new, not to be contained by university press, not to be beholden to a certain nonprofit organization, but to really try to do whatever we wanted to do. And we were able to convince the funders and Ruskies of this particular idea. And we also didn't want it to be just us. I know David Ruskies had chosen us, and we could have decided that it was, where we're just going to do it all or really circumscribe it. But we also didn't want to then bring in people that were, older, more experienced than us, that, had various involvement in other journals, whether it be Proof Text, a journal of Jewish literary studies, or any of the other numerous Jewish studies journals that are out there. And so we called up our friends and our friends of our friends and all the other younger generation of people in Yiddish studies. And I think in 2013, December of 2013, we met for the first time at the AJS, the Jewish Studies Conference. And we had a vague idea what we wanted, but really it became a very collaborative project from the very beginning. So not just an academic journal, but a journal that would have a blog section, that would have a pedagogy section where we talk about teaching Yiddish, Yiddish culture and Yiddish language, and a robust section for translation, and also academic journals, but also be it online, have it be, mobile friendly and all different kinds of media friendly, and to never really have any print issue, and to really push Yiddish studies and the academic journal to be something that could be accessible to all people and to anyone interested in Yiddish, to be both academic and popular at the same time. I think at the time, in a kind of hubris that we had, we said that we would be the N+1 of Yiddish studies. That was the idea.
That's great to hear. There is like a model in mind. And it sounds like it's kind of an argument for why we might all try to keep in touch with, I guess, senior folks in the field. Sometimes they might be closer to funders or people who can kind of make these things happen.
Yeah, no, we were very lucky to have that sort of seed funding for a couple of years. We had to create our own nonprofit. We learned a lot about New York nonprofit law. We had to find lawyers to do work pro bono. We had to do a lot of paperwork. At first, we also were going to break the law. I think we were going to make ourselves also presidents of the board of the organization and also workers at the organization. So we had to sort of figure that out and find other people to come in. And we had to learn we're going to have to actually fundraise too. We have this seed funding, which was great for the first couple of years, but also figure out what the model was going to be. We knew we wanted it to be open access and free for everyone, but that's, a choice we made at the beginning, but that was going to have to change also what was going to be underneath the journal. And we always, sort of like working hard on that at the beginning so that it wouldn't be sort of taken over by university press or hidden behind paywalls that happen with all journals, more or less, that are out there.
Yeah, and I'll just say that he's working hard at the beginning, but also working hard throughout, that actually our funding structure and our being independent has been a source of considerable labor for all 10 years of the project thus far.
Jessica, can you explain to us what that has meant? What have you had to do?
Well, a lot of it is fundraising, approaching different foundations, but also managing our own finances. So making sure that payments happen and keeping track of bank accounts and taxes and various things that if we were attached to an organization, then maybe there would be a staff person who would be in charge of that. But we are our own staff people. And some of that has been an incredible amount of volunteer labor as well as paid labor for the journal.
Speaking of this kind of labor, I'm curious, Sarah, Jessica, and Dalia, when you all came on board and what stages of your careers you were in.
Yeah, I came on board fairly early. Saul contacted me, and I remember having a number of different conversations. We were both living in New York at that time, so we had a lot of in-person conversations, in the car conversations about what this would look like. And in the beginning, I had a lot of the responsibility for the finances. And so it was, as Jessica said, a huge learning experience. Trying to, I remember at one point we had put in an application for a grant and we had gotten the grant, but we had not received notification that we got the grant until the check arrived in the mail. So I ferried the check to one of our board members at a concert that evening. So it was a little bit scrappy in the beginning, and we did receive an enormous amount of assistance from one of these organizations in New York that provides pro bono services to not-for-profits. We learned we had to have a seal, for example, all sorts of things like that. And I remember one of my earlier roles was working very closely with Saul to develop the website, to figure out what this is going to look like. We want something responsive that's going to work on mobile phones, right? On cell phones. We want something where we can, where footnotes are easy to locate and access. And we knew at the beginning also that it was really, really important that we appealed to people who were learning Yiddish, which is a lot of people, even though we weren't a Yiddish language program, but that we needed to have this broader appeal, not necessarily just for people who want to read academic articles about literature and history and linguistics. And that was really important. And that was also part of the reason that we wanted it to be open access and widely available. So the fundraising was and is incredibly important for that. But also the design. We wanted something that looked really clean, really modern, but also kind of harkened back to other sort of recognizable art forms. And so we found a studio to work with, which was really fantastic. And we took pitches, but it was all of these kind of business things that none of us really had experience in. So it was very exciting and very new, I think, for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
I got involved with the journal pretty early on because I was good friends with Saul. I remember him telling me about it in the carols of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary when I was sometimes working there. But at first, I was just part of the editorial board, and I was part of the pedagogy working group from the beginning, and very committed to the idea that the journal should have a pedagogy section. And I think part of the reason I was so excited about that was because I had spent a lot of time working with the pedagogy materials at the Jewish Women's Archive website. I had been teaching with them in a kind of Sunday school setting, and really came to understand kind of like what having those resources out there could do in terms of making it possible for someone who maybe didn't have expertise in the material to be able to teach it and share it. And I was really excited about the idea of translating, if you will, some of the other kinds of material that were going to happen on the site into something that was more pedagogy focused, so that the material that would be more academic would be usable for a variety of different audiences. And so that was where a lot of my energy went in the beginning. And then for 2 years, I was the pedagogy editor. I remember interviewing for what is now Dalia's position, the translation position, and all of my ideas were about pedagogy. And I think it was Sarah who said to me, well, why don't you just edit the pedagogy section then? And so that was really how I came into it. And we've talked about a number of different kinds of professionalizing experiences. And some of the things that I have learned have included how to be an editor, but also how to be a manager. I've had a lot of opportunities to hire people, which is something that I otherwise wouldn't have experienced in my regular working life. And so having that kind of managerial role has been really helpful to me in just having different kinds of professional experiences, and a different sense of myself and my role in the world of Yiddish studies as well. And we were all kind of like making it up as we went along. There wasn't, even if there were existing models, like there have been many other organizations that have similar kinds of publishing outlets, none of us had worked for them. And so there was this feeling that we had to decide, how is it that we want to create a journal? How is it that we want to have these different workflows and processes, and how do we want to relate to one another as a team? And a lot of it has been, I think, more, determined by our own personalities and relationships to one another.
Yeah, and I'll just say for myself, I joined In Geveb in the fall of 2021. I had some experience writing and editing, but this was really the first role that I applied for that was editing at that level of intensity and responsibility. And of course, I was very, very lucky to have Saul, who spoke with me about the journal and sort of clued me in on what this work and what the culture might be. And I was very honored to be given the role. And there's so much that I've learned through the role. But I remember that in the very early days when I had the mentorship of Daniel Kennedy, whose Google Drive I inherited. He was the translations editor before me, and we walked through the whole process. I familiarized myself with the workflow. I was very overwhelmed, but also very lucky to have his instruction. I had the support of the whole team, and I think early on I was thrown into the challenges and the rewards of the kind of project management that this role involved, where I was managing, a dozen, say, translations from pending review all the way up to the first translation that was published, Gelt, where it had already gone through all of the stages and all I needed to do was upload it. But projects in various stages, managing those, entering into this collaborative environment where I was also learning how to write a collegial email and working through all the very many stages of editing, developmental editing, copy editing, and so on. So it was definitely a learning curve, and I was glad to have support from many, many sides.
It sounds like a really supportive vibe you guys have there. I'm not confident that every journal has that feeling, and I Saul, I can't help but think this is partly because of you and I guess the other founding editors. And I hear it, Sarah's been there long, and it sounds like she's had that influence with people. Are you guys conscious of trying to kind of cultivate this good feeling? I mean, it sounds great.
I think for me, it was such an energizing experience to spend time with my colleagues and friends and building something together. If you've opened up any acknowledgments page of any academic book of any kind, they start with this caveat: though this work is lonely, here are the 70,000 people I'm going to thank.
Right.
But you feel like you have to do that gesture. And we were told, right, writing a dissertation or being at that stage in your dissertation, all of us were graduate students still at the time, except for Eitan. Eitan, I think, had finished. But we were all very new academics, that we were going to be lonely. We were going to be in the stacks. We were going to be in the archives. We were going to just be working away at this chapter that just won't end. But here is no, actually, I'd rather go to this. We did Google Hangouts. We were doing Zoom before there was Zoom.
Right.
And we were spending hours together working on the stuff that we were very passionate about and very excited about and deeply interested about. So I would look forward to this work, and I wanted the work to be it was collaborative, and that was what was most exciting about it for me. I mean, the Yiddish stuff was also fun, but it was working with people that I deeply cared about and who cared about the work we were doing and how to do it together. We should mention Mindel Cohen, one of the other of the four of us at the beginning, was Sarah Zarrow, Eitan, me, and Mindel was a labor organizer as a graduate student. So we also had that feeling of if we don't think about our labor in a collective way, Mendel's going to be disappointed in us. So at least for me, it inspired me to be okay, how can we be as democratic as possible in this work? And we were also very conscious at the same time of what startup culture was like. So this is 2013, and sort of we didn't want to burn ourselves out. Mindel had us, I don't know if they still do it, Jessica can tell me otherwise, but we had to clock our hours to make sure we weren't working too much on the project. And making sure that we were giving stuff to other people if we were feeling overwhelmed ourselves. I was not good at that because I wanted to just do all of the work because I was so excited about it. But it did constantly keep me conscious of how can I let someone else into this work? How can I share work with them? And also, the knowledge that we had was that I don't want this only to be mine. We wanted to immediately bring in more people. We wanted to replace ourselves. We wanted other early career scholars to be involved as soon as possible. If we were going to get jobs, we were going to again give over responsibility to other people as soon as possible to keep up that kind of collaborative and democratic mode.
Yeah. And I would add that some of the stuff we did in the very beginning, especially when many of us were located in New York, was we had fundraising events and things like that. And I think Eitan and I were asked to speak on a panel that's disrupting Yiddish or something like this, right? And that was the sort of age of I don't know, tech disruption, which I think we were a little bit apprehensive about. But we were able to bring people in this way, both in terms of maybe potentially donating, but just also kind of fans, readers, our public. And that was also enormously energizing, because I agree with Saul, the academic work it's often solitary, even though we're all in the humanities, we're interested in people. But we don't do our work collaboratively. Usually our work is individual. And so to be able to have this project, to have this kind of sustained energy with a group, and then also this kind of broader circle of people who were more peripherally involved or who knew about us, was really, really important. And it was just something that, for me, I think I was about 2 years away from finishing my degree when this started. And it's that last stage, and it is what it is. It was horrible in certain ways, and being able to kind of turn my attention to something else really helped. And I think that one project kind of fed the other in a certain way, and that felt really, really important. And I think that's and that's something we learned about, right? We wanted to be good. We wanted to be good colleagues to each other. We wanted to be good managers when it came time to actually really hiring people. We wanted to work with organizations who also seem to have those values, and it still feels really important. And it felt really important at the time.
Can I just add one quick thing, Jessica? I also was sort of wanted to be a continued pedagogical thing. So we would go up to people and say you should write for In Geveb, and they'd be like, no. Or by the time we had a very good reputation, it was like, oh, that's not for me, or I'm not ready for it. But it was like, no, you wrote a great paper this semester. This text that you're interested should be translated. You should write for it. You should just, go. It should be part of your plan to become part of this project in some way. And I'm like very proud to have my graduate student Dalia Wolfson on this podcast with me, because that was, that's the goal, that it shouldn't be this thing that's small, or that feels scary, or that has certain kinds of barriers to entry, but that, you immediately, once you're involved in Yiddish, I, as an editor or as a board member or whatever, I wanted immediately that person to try to get involved in any way possible.
Yeah, just to kind of, because the question of how much of it has continued that way versus, it was set out in a certain way, were we continuing that way? And I think that there has been a lot of continuity, but one thing that hasn't happened is Saul talked about this intention to turn over a lot, but actually I've been there for a very long time. And so in some ways, a lot of other positions turned over, but in some ways as we became more stable, realized that there was some benefit to having some people in place long term in order to promote the kind of training and turnover in other roles as well. And that having kind of constantly training people in to every single role was actually maybe more disruptive and more difficult than we wanted to take on. And so it's been this kind of fine tuning balance of figuring out how to both be as, I think, radically inclusive as possible and offer as many opportunities as possible, and also offer a kind of stability to the organization that I think the person who has really enabled that most of all has been Mindel Cohen, who has for years and years, and really on a volunteer basis, been providing a lot of that stability through her role as the president of our board of directors. And she's kind of I think, really the unsung hero of the entire operation. And as much as she was careful in setting up these kind of labor precedents in the beginning for making sure people didn't overwork or overextend. I think if anyone has overextended, it's Mindel. And so I think it's worth acknowledging that the tremendous amount of labor that she really has put into it. And then also that the rest of us have put into it. We don't keep track of our hours anymore. And I wouldn't want to. It would look very scary for me personally if I saw how many hours I put into this project, especially, certain times of year or whatever, certain aspects of the project can get kind of overwhelming. And for me, when I first got involved in an official capacity as an editor, I was finishing my dissertation. I was living in Kansas, far away from my graduate program. I was finishing remotely. I had 2 children under the age of 2, and I was like very, very disconnected from my colleagues, from my feeling of being part of academia. I wasn't sure if I would have an academic role, and I was looking for something that would kind of keep me tethered to the things that I had been working on before I moved to Kansas, and to make me feel less isolated, and also just to kind of like, you will keep me in the game somehow. And that's what In Geveb offered me. And it really was a kind of like a bridge or a tether or something that connected me until I ended up back. Really wasn't very much longer until I got this position at the University of Chicago, and I was in academia again. And I couldn't say, but I would imagine that my landing that position was not, in some small part at least, due to the fact that I had this continuity in my CV and that I was publishing about language pedagogy when I wasn't teaching language. And so I had this kind of continuous employment in Yiddish language pedagogy.
Jessica, since you mentioned that, how, maybe your participation and involvement and leadership in the journal was helpful, it sounds like in keeping you connected, but maybe even in getting positions, or, this looked good to your potential employers. I'm curious if the rest of you have felt this has been useful on my CV, or just even in an interview to be able to talk about what I've done.
I'll say that one thing that for me, and this, again, not just in getting the position, but in the level of confidence that I felt in being a leader, I felt right away that I had the opportunity to write to people as In Geveb, or speak as In Geveb, instead of speaking as myself. And so I could write to, a prominent scholar in the field and say, what do you think about this book? In Geveb is interested in your opinions. And it allowed me to develop relationships with people that I felt like were maybe on a little more equal playing field, or that maybe I would have been too shy to approach otherwise. And it gave me kind of even just like a different mindset. I felt a kind of responsibility for or to the world of Yiddish studies in some way, because I was in some way sort of sitting on top of it as the editor in chief of a journal that I at least aspired would become like really important for the field. And so I felt a sense of like, yeah, responsibility to take that seriously and to be quite active and not to do what maybe my impulse would have been to do, which is to kind of be shy and even sort of self-effacing. And so in some ways, we've talked about a lot of isms. We've talked about like labor organizing and being collaborative, but I think there was a certain kind of feminist sensibility that I brought to the role, especially as for a lot of its history, we continue to be a majority woman team of editors, and that I don't think was by design, but I think that our collective feminism has really influenced the way we run the journal.
I mean, it was by design for me, at least at the beginning. I don't know if it continued that way. But Jessica's selling herself short. I mean, Jessica's a big shot. And I think, like she's a big shot in the field. And I just wanted to make sure you don't sell yourself short. That like whether it's because of In Geveb or otherwise, I just that is absolutely true.
For listeners who are early stage academics, and it sounds like that you guys mostly were when you got on board the journal, and if our listeners are wondering, would I have time to be involved in a journal in the kind of deeply involved way that you all have been? How do you explain how you fit it in? Sarah, it was helpful that you mentioned that it might have actually helped to have this to sometimes escape to, or to be able to be productive and helpful and then go back to your own work. What would the rest of you say about, or Sarah too, about how this has worked with your time management skills?
I don't know that I've always successfully fit it in with the rest of my responsibilities, but I would say that that kind of work of editing and being in conversations about translation and supporting other translators is something that's been very energizing and a nice complement to teaching and research. So I think that it's a role that keeps me in contact and invigorated around the work that I do, and makes me feel like I'm in community, even in, the last, especially, this year of really focusing on the dissertation. It's been a vital and more social part.
There are aspects of this role that allow me to do things in my job that I otherwise couldn't do because of the nature of my position. So I'm a non-tenure track position. In an official capacity, I can't mentor graduate students. I only do it unofficially or in language classes. I can't be on a dissertation committee. There are many different kinds of things that maybe in a different kind of role I would naturally be able to do, but that In Geveb has become my outlet for that. So I think I do quite a lot of mentorship through In Geveb, and that has been a real gift. That's something that I love to do. And then I also integrate it back into my role in the university. So I have an undergraduate intern that's funded through the University of Chicago, and so that allows me to kind of integrate it into my work in some way as part of my teaching within the university. And of course, then I teach using In Geveb resources all the time. And so I think in some ways the two roles feed each other. And in some ways, often they don't. Often it means that I'm working late at night, or sometimes not infrequently when I was running the social media for In Geveb, my students would catch me clicking the post button on Facebook for In Geveb right before I would start teaching. These kind of like these just like scrambling to do all of the things all the time. So it can be quite a lot to do all of those things, but they do fit together in different ways.
Yeah, thanks for admitting that it sometimes works that way.
I'm on the West Coast, so I know how late sometimes people send emails, because I get them when it's not so late for me.
I just want to echo something Jessica said beforehand about what starting a journal can do. Is first, we had like all this anxiety that like we weren't going to be an authority that we wanted to be, that we like no one was going to take us seriously, that we weren't going to get this person or that person to submit to us and give us some kind of reputation. But I think part of the ambition of that was like, oh, we want to have that kind of hold or capacity to understand what Yiddish studies is. We want it, like our first issue and what we've returned to over and over again, I think, as a journal is what is Yiddish studies? And just the capacity to ask that question about your field is not something you're often taught as a graduate student. Like if as a graduate student, you go to your exams and there's a what is Yiddish studies, and there's like 5 books or 3 books or whatever your field is, those are the books you have to read and be able to answer the question in your exams. It's not something you necessarily question about the field, what it is or what it could be. And I think asking that question, forcing ourselves and asking other people to answer that question for us in as if it were really an open question, announcing Yiddish studies as an open thing, I think gave me a lot of confidence to answer that question later, or to have my own research speak to that. We're always asked the so what question, or what is your project, your dissertation project, your research project, whatever it is, what does it have to say about the field or multiple fields at once? I think doing this kind of work on a journal, on a field defining journal, allowed me to say, oh yeah, this is what I have to say about this field. This is how I would answer this question that I'm already asking everybody else that comes through, every article that comes through. I'm asking them, what are you doing? What are you doing for Yiddish studies? So what I have to ask myself that question too. So for me, it's really, helped me feel like those are the questions I want to ask myself, and that's what I want to hold my own work to, that standard of always trying to understand what my contribution is, or what people I'm in dialogue with, and what the field is that I'm actually working in.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I understand the field about a bazillion times better than I otherwise would have. Also, its global nature, because I have spent so much time. I do a lot of cold emailing of people I don't know to ask them if they would be interested in reviewing a book or writing something, or, oh, I heard there's this interesting concert happening in your town. Will you go to it for us or whatever? And so building connections, but even just knowing who the names of those people are and that something is happening there all over the world has really enriched my understanding of what Yiddish studies is. And it is so much bigger than I understood it to be 10 years ago.
I miss it since I'm not an editor. I don't know what's happening in Sweden, or I don't, I like this kind of understanding of the whole breadth of the field is really a privilege that the editors of the journal get to have.
A couple of you have referenced the readers and fans. How have you come to know who your readers are?
In the early years, we had some reader surveys, but we haven't done one in a while. Maybe we're due for one now that we're at our 10-year mark. So we'll put that on our to-do list. But so in the early years, we did have some direct feedback, but also we've always from the beginning been rather active on social media. And that was something, Saul said they were of the blog generation. I started college, the first year that I was in college, Facebook came out. So I was really a child of the social media generation. And in fact, I remember when Saul asked me if I wanted to be involved in the journal, one of the things he said was, "You're always posting weird Yiddish stuff on your Facebook feed. Why not do it for our journal instead?" And so there was the sense of knowing at least who some of those people were, because they were posting about it or in social media, or they were circulating it in social media. And we had a feeling of what at least some of the buzz might be, although it was always a concern that we were only getting a partial view because we were only seeing the people who were engaging in that way. We get almost no emails from people telling us what their feedback is about something. And so there was one time when we had some poetry about the war in Israel and Gaza, and we got some emails, a handful of emails about it. And we ended up publishing about that because it felt so rare to have some feedback that I felt like maybe that was in itself a moment, something of note. So we know surprisingly little sometimes about what people think about the journal, but people cite it a lot too. So that's another way of tracking what people are using it for.
We used to have parties. We had big parties that were covered in the forward. So, no, we also did have a big party just to celebrate the 10-year anniversary. So I think that's another way to think about connection to fans and readers, is that it is kind of, we wanted to be a little bit of like a social space, not just for us, the editors, to know what everybody else is doing, but that the graduate students at AJS are talking about In Geveb, or whatever. And that felt both good for our egos, but I think that's one of the points of the journal, like to be a place of conversation.
Yeah, we have a coffee gathering at the AJS, and we're like a small nonprofit with not that much money. And so we can't even buy coffee for people. We just tell them to come to a cafe while they're at the AJS and come at a particular time and meet your favorite In Geveb editors. And it is always packed. The past couple of years anyway, it's been like absolute packed. And so that's gives a sense of like this really a feeling that we have a vibrant and excited reading community.
And not just Yiddishists, but the point is that people who have any kind of adjacent interest in Yiddish come to In Geveb. So that's another thing that I think we wanted at the beginning, and that Jessica's definitely, and that editors have definitely perpetuated, the sense of like, oh, you think you're not in Yiddish studies, but you're the person I want to review this book about Yiddish. You're the person that whose insight is adjacent or in some way related to this, that you're going to want to see this translation because it's going to mean something to you.
That's something that I've really appreciated about the journal and working on the journal, because I'm one of those people who would say, really sure I'm in Yiddish studies per se, but lots of the work I do is with Yiddish sources, and occasionally language politics also becomes really important in my work. And I think that that's I think that's one of the appeals of the journal, right? That it's not necessarily, there is this questioning about what is Yiddish studies and how big can it be, but it also doesn't feel exclusive to Yiddish studies, right? There are lots and lots of people who use Yiddish in their work, who need to use Yiddish in our work. And I think that it's been really important. I've appreciated over the years, when I was on the editorial board, just getting requests to review a translation or to review the historical notes for a translation or something like that, because that's also really important to have all of the scholars who are adjacent, have our eyes on the journal, and to see what's happening, and to kind of be able to make these connections kind of from adjacent areas through Yiddish studies to another adjacent area. And I think that that's been really important for me, to be involved in something that I feel like is not quite my field, but it's really close, and to feel that there's room for me there. And nobody's tried to convince me that I'm secretly in Yiddish studies yet. So,
although you are.
Yeah, I just would echo what Sarah is saying. I think that the In Geveb readership community is so wide, and there's really a range of ways that people engage with In Geveb. And, I'll hear from graduate students that they had read a particular translation, and that might be one, a single point of contact. There might be someone who follows the blog religiously, and then there might be a Yiddish language instructor who's integrated a particular lesson plan that they got from the pedagogy section into their curriculum, on a year-to-year basis. So there's, that the immediate moment of reading, but there are also ways in which this, material on here enters syllabi in new ways.
It used to be that when new students were thinking about coming to the University of Chicago, sometimes they'd be in touch with me, and I would say, oh yeah, and one of the things that I do is I edit this journal. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's called In Geveb. You should look it up. And in recent years, I have used the same line, and I've had students laugh, because of course, if they're interested at all in Yiddish, then they know what In Geveb is.
Telling you, Jessica, you're a big shot. You just have to come to terms with you.
I know, but the journal is a big shot, and I speak for the journal, like the Lorax speaks for the trees. But yeah, no, it's gives us a sense of how important the journal has become.
Yeah, that's great to get to see that change. If listeners are thinking that they might want to start their own academic journal, what's your advice or caution?
I don't know if I have any advice or caution, because I think we need more. Because that's the thing that's been interesting to me, is that this is a model that we thought, oh, everybody's going to do this, because it felt natural to us. It was hard, but it was also like, oh, this seems like a very good idea, right? Even 10 years ago, academic publishing, people were saying it's going down the drain, or it's not sustainable, or who's going to buy books. And especially now in the age of AI, and how AI has used all of those pirated books in order to build itself up, right? So what are the new ways to do academia, to do scholarship in a way that's both super rigorous, but also engaging in a way that most, paywall journals are not? And frankly, I don't think there have been many that have taken up that same model, that still journals are behind paywalls, still journals are attached to university presses. So I don't want to put any boundary up to anybody who's hesitating. Just do it. And I think that was the thing that I felt, was just like, I think there was a question whether we were going to get the funding, not going to get the funding, for a moment. And I just said to Eitan, I don't care if we don't get the money. Let's just do it. I have this WordPress site. I came up with my own little logo that I made, that I keep and love dearly to this day, that wasn't paid for, that was just like weird clip art or something. And I was just committed, like, let's just do it. And so there is a blog that's sort of done that. It's called the Ancient Jew Review, which does this sort of similar, but doesn't have the same funding structure necessarily. that I would recommend also that people look at for a model. And there's other kinds of journals that or sort of magazine-y kind of things and blogs that do this sort of thing, or newsletters of individual people or groups of people that do it. But I think we need more of them because we need to reinvent continually what the academic journal is, especially in a time when the academy at large is in crisis. We need more creative thinking around publishing. Like our model feels old now. Like what's the newer thing? What are the ways to solve some of the problems or frustrations around funding in particular that a place like In Geveb has?
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of things that I think have made us successful. One is that I think we have this inbuilt Yiddish community that has an idea of itself as a community, and that is a community that includes not just academics, and that we were interested in connecting the dots between, say, the klezmer world, the world of people who were Yiddish enthusiasts in various ways, as well as students and academics. And so there were these different spheres of, maybe we'll call them Yiddish practitioners or Yiddish involved folks. And our journal was able to be a bridge for that and help gather them as a community. And maybe it's about identifying who those different possible readerships are and thinking about what their needs are, and building something that would help to connect between those communities. It might not look the same as In Geveb because maybe those are not communities that are interested in music and theater and all the things that people who go to Kles Canada or Yiddish New York are interested in. Maybe there's a different set of concerns about, I don't know, whatever it is, literary translation or contemporary politics or something, but trying to figure out what those sort of academic adjacent interests are might be helpful. And the other thing is, like, have good friends and build friendships and come from a place of friendship. Because I think one of the things that we did from the beginning was value our work and pay ourselves and pay the people who write for us. And that has always been an important principle that has made it challenging because there's the funding issues, but also provided a sense of dignity for the work that we were doing. And especially for me in the beginning, when I started doing this, when I didn't have a job and I was a stay-at-home mom largely, having that paycheck, even if it was a small one, was an enormous source of dignity for me. So that has been really important. But more than that has been the sense of, like, doing this in a community of people who supported each other and valued each other and could catch one another if we were having a busy week or a difficult time. So yeah, so those are, I think, some key foundations blocks of the journal.
Those are things that I think are not necessarily taught in grad school. Like you have to learn, you either come in with it or you learn it yourself. It can be, I think, challenging. And I think for some people, like that is something extremely difficult. It's not what we're trained to do. And I don't, I think that that's just important to note, that I think that kind of collaboration is not, at least for humanities, it's really not what we're trained to do. Individual advisors vary, but I think for a lot of us, it's not what we were trained to do.
Yeah, I just want to echo that 100%. That the university is a super hierarchical place with, people having responsibility or control over every different level, whether it be a senior faculty or junior faculty to a graduate student and down to an undergraduate. And I think that was something that we consciously tried to avoid, and I think we still try to perpetuate. But it also means, like, this thing can't be structured like the university, even though it's about the academy, or it's adjacent to the academy, for it to sustain itself in any way. I know that there are lots of journals that go through various crises when they switch editors, or there's all these rules around switching of editors and bringing in new editors, or what an editorial board does, or what peer review is. And these are things that we thought about seriously and continue to think about seriously, but they feel, I don't know, they feel more open than this sort of, like, trying to figure out exactly what the perfect scientific way is to build a journal. No, like, this is an open thing that we can decide and build together. I think is a much better model than what is the right way to do it. Who's going to pass this exam and who isn't, kind of feel that can, turn the academy into a place of not just hierarchy, but also certain kinds of abuse. So I think this is, this for me was a way to do all of the work, but in a way that feels more collaborative, feels more built on solidarity, and feels like a place that I would want to continue working and never really stop.
And also, you don't have to pretend to know something you don't know when you're working collaboratively. So there's so much that I don't know how to do that I'm frankly not good at because I'm not very organized or maybe not all that tech savvy. And instead of saying, here is how I understand the field of Yiddish studies, and here's how I understand editing, and you should all do these things. I really come at it from this place of, you all have these incredible skills from wherever it is that you came from. So you had an internship in publishing, or you've done so much work in translation. And so, like, you tell me how we should be running this thing and we'll do it together. We just hired a new managing editor. One of the first things I said to her is, I suppose technically I'm your boss, but I'm not a very bossy boss. And kind of go from there. And so I think that's been not just sort of like helpful in a kind of kumbaya way, but actually like makes the journal much better because each person has their expertise, and that expertise is really valued and heard.
And it's structural. I was just reading our early emails. I went back and read some of the emails from 2013, and we had always proposed the journal as a 3-part journal: translations, academic articles, and a blog. And, Jessica said no, or Jessica and Sarah said, no, you need a pedagogy section. So we're like, okay, I guess it's now 4. It's just sort of like that kind of feeling of like an academic journal is like this, and it has these parts. And it's, if you want, you can have a section with letters that also on top of review, those kind of rules that we associate with the traditional journal. And no, we just had people come in and said, this was valuable to me in this other context, and we need it as Yiddish teachers. And so we were just like, okay, you make it. And then it happened. So that, I think it's also can be structural. I mean, maybe there are new sections of the journal that need to come into being, or other ones we need to get rid of. And I think that could happen if they wanted it to. There's no like rules in that sense.
Yeah, the website itself has its own inflexibilities, but within that structure, one thing that I often say is that my goal when someone pitches to us is to try to figure out how to get to a yes, and it might be that the yes is, this is not really an academic article, but would you want to write a blog about it or something like that? But sometimes the answer is no, but usually the answer is maybe let's figure out how.
That's great to hear. We've spoken to some other editors on the past on this podcast, and sometimes they give us insight into how they deal with this whole reviewer number 2 or harsh, nasty review. You guys have such a culture of support and collaboration that I wonder if you encounter that or how you deal with it.
So we have a peer review process for some parts of the journal. So the journal has its blog side. That blog is not peer reviewed, but translation is peer reviewed, and Dalia can talk about that. Pedagogy is not peer reviewed, but the academic side of the journal is. And so on the blog side, on the pedagogy side, we don't have a reviewer number 2, as it were. We have me and currently Jackie, usually bouncing ideas off of each other, and in a more sort of collaborative way, in a more collaborative in the sense that we're talking directly to the author and developing it with them. But on the other side, there is this element of judgment and wondering if something is up to a particular standard. And we do have, I think, pretty high standards. But a valve for that is that if something doesn't fit on the peer review side, but we think the idea is good, then a thing that having the pedagogy and the blog section allows for is a kind of safety valve where we don't have to say no. We can say, we're saying no for this section, but actually that would, make a really interesting exercise in a classroom. Could you write it up for pedagogy instead or something? So that I think does mitigate some of the harshness of a peer review system. But maybe I'll let Saul and Sarah talk more about the peer review section because you both worked on it, and Dalia talk about the translation section.
Just adding to what Jessica said, I do think that our peer review process is very humane, right? We all submit to peer review publications as well. And, I wrote about this when I came back onto the peer review team because I was so horrified at the time that my colleague at the university just got a peer review that was very clearly just sort of fabricated with AI. I mean, it just didn't, it was just insulting, right? Like it wasn't reviewed by a human. And I think that our process, we've really tried to make it humane and also helpful because we know that many of the submissions we get are from early career scholars. And I think that it's really important to not, to be helpful. Either maybe that's funneling something that's not quite like peer review article material into another section. But it could also be just like really giving quite a lot of feedback, pointed feedback, helpful feedback in different categories. And I think that's been enormously important. And my sense is that authors appreciate that as well. And I think that it also makes for this is like another aspect of the collaboration, right? It's not just the collaboration between us who are working on the journal or us in a reading public, it's us and our authors. And I do think that that's something special. I mean, I've submitted a number of places and there are better and worse experiences. But that does seem like something that's solely particular to us. But it does seem like something that's really special.
I would just add that I never relied on peer review. We'd put out for peer review, but we always decided beforehand whether we were invested in the piece or not. When I worked with Sunny Yudkov on the peer review section, and we were committed, regardless of what came back, to help the person turn this into a better piece. And so that means, at least for me, the peer review means something. It's not like it's meaningless, but that we need to frame the peer review. We need to frame the feedback for the author, rather than make them come up with some kind of response and have them jump through hoops or balance peer review number one against number two, who say different things about the same stuff. My job as an editor, I felt, was this developmental mode of like, how can I guide the person toward the things that we want as a journal, because we have a voice as editors of the peer review section, and what we think is going to make the most productive kind of article out of it. We don't have to solve all problems, but we do need to give the person a sort of roadmap for the kind of piece that, especially if you're dealing with a younger and early career scholar, what's the roadmap towards the best possible piece? And then after the peer review, we did a lot of developmental editing, Sunny and I, over time, of like, this needs to be changed here, this needs to go this place, so you need to develop this idea further, send this back in once you figured out this problem that you have with the piece. And, some things made it take a long time and very work intensive, but I think led to some really exciting things. And we were just asked as part of the 10-year anniversary to write short pieces on essays that we really liked, or things out of In Geveb that we're really remembering or taking with us. And there's a number of articles like that I know where they were when they came in, and where they ended up is part of our work, though we don't necessarily get as much credit for it. It's sort of it's where I learned how to give feedback to graduate students. It's where I learned how to give constructive but very productive feedback. It's different when you're in a small, like, peer-to-peer group and you're like figuring something out. It was like, the feedback I give now will depend on whether like this piece is going to get read, whether it's going to have an impact on our field. So it felt consequential, and it felt big. I'm just thinking right now of a very big piece that we've had that still people turn to. We need to talk about Shmuel Charny, which was like a piece about a person with an offensive pseudonym in the Yiddish literature, and we needed to think about how this piece was written by someone who wasn't a Yiddishist, and that needed a lot of help, and also an early career scholar. So it was just, an exciting, we immediately we're like, oh, this is important, but it needs a lot of work. How can we get it to the finish line?
Yeah. And something that I think we were conscious of then and continue to be conscious of is that the rewards and vulnerability of being an online publication without a paywall, that the authors who are writing for us, unlike in some academic publications, very well could be read by people who are themselves not academics, or it could be shared. And that, so we want to make sure that everyone who publishes with us is publishing something that they will be proud of if it gets circulated, when it gets circulated.
I'll just say, for the translation section, the way that we do peer review is we ask members of our editorial board, past editors, present editors, to review a translation when it comes in. And to this point, that's always making about sort of supporting writers and helping them get to the best product. Sometimes that starts even at that stage. I think knowing over time, as I've gotten to know the different peer reviewers that we solicit for the translation section, knowing their proclivities and their, the things that they might be paying attention to in particular, where they might be a little bit softer. I think as an editor, looking at reviewer one, looking at reviewer two, thinking about my own capacity to support the writer. And there, sometimes, even before the reviewers are involved, I might ask the translator to revise their introduction a little bit so that it can make a more compelling case for relevance to the field, for example, which is one of our translation rubric elements. And then, there is a judgment call to be made, but I think that it comes oftentimes from a spirit of generosity. And if we get to the point of a revise and resubmit, we'll provide feedback in a way that points to larger issues. And so I think that, especially with some of these emerging translators that come in, there is support even before the peer review stage starts. And then as those reviews come in, being able to weigh whether that submission can be nurtured and supported in the way, if it's weak in certain aspects. And if there is a rejection, then allow it first, giving feedback on particular examples, redirecting to other publications. And there are other venues, especially for translation, where the experience will be different. But what's nice about translations is there really are, it's not just academic journals, there are a variety of literary journals that one can submit to. So there are many possibilities there.
It sounds like a really helpful and humane review process. In closing, I wonder if those of you who have a writing habit or practice that is working for you, this is a question we usually ask guests.
I saw this as you sent us this question beforehand, knowing I was not able to prepare because I don't feel like I've got good habits. Keep on feeling like there's the people with their pomodoros and there's the people with their in the morning and or just in the afternoon or on these days or schedule it into your. And I've tried all of them. I've failed all of them. I think the only advice that I ever got that worked for me was from Svetlana Boym of blessed memory. And she said, when you're feeling frustrated, and I'm sure Dalia has heard me say this to her like 17 billion times, just write innocently. And it takes a certain person like Svetlana Boym. If anyone knew her, she had this theorist of Russian literature, but of all things, she had a capacity to just sort of reduce judgment on herself and just write things out and just sort of like let it all out. And none of it may be useful, but some of it might be if you return to it. And that kind of writing innocently and then return to one's judgmental vision later is something that requires a certain amount of confidence in yourself also. So just to acknowledge that, but this kind of always telling myself, just write innocently, and then you'll come back to it, and it'll either be okay or it won't. But at least you'll have felt like you did something. I know that's close to the one sentence a day or one paragraph a day model, which I don't like. But this, I think I would need to go in with this sense of like, well, I'm just letting it out.
That's great.
I can say something helpful that I don't always do, but I try, which is to switch off between like time-oriented and task-oriented writing. Like task-oriented is like, I'm going to knock out this opening paragraph in just a crappy draft and I'm going to do it for however long it takes. Time-oriented is like, in these 20 minutes, I'm going to work on something. And that's been helpful. But I would say, my best advice is to not read stuff like Getting Things Done, which assume that, I don't know, like you're cleaning and you're cooking and all of your caretaking duties are done by somebody else. Those types of self-help manuals are not helpful for many people. I think not just women, but people who strive to be in egalitarian living situations don't necessarily get a lot from advice that doesn't take into account the multifaceted nature of our lives. So I've tried to throw those out as much as possible.
Yeah.
I would say two things for me. One is that there is no such thing as bad or wasted writing. And that means also that I write in a lot of modes. I write a lot about pedagogy. Sometimes I'm writing things that I'm going to say in class because I'm not a person who speaks extemporaneously very much comfortably. And so that is a kind of writing. And I also write poetry sometimes. And I don't think any of that is a waste of time. It's keeping the things spinning and letting me think about them in different ways. And then they come out, and I reuse them in different capacities. So I think none of it's wasted. And I try not to let myself feel bad if the 5 minutes I had to write was spent trying to think of a rhyme for a poem that no one's going to see. Because that was also a constructive thing to do with my time, I think. But the other thing is something that really working with the journal has taught me, which is, send it to a friend, send it to 10 friends, because it's better to write in community.
Yeah, I was about to say something similar, which I feel like I've heard a lot recently, which is that writing is for one person, the publishing is collaborative, and sort of how helpful it is to have friends along the way, whether it's an outline or a very scrappy, rough-edged draft, or you're starting to pitch it somewhere. Writing in community is always a way to keep the writing going.
I sent an article that I was drafting to Dalia, and I got some of the best feedback that I've ever gotten. And she's not one of my normal people that I send it to, just because out of habit I've been sending it to the same people since graduate school. And so send it to lots of people and send it to the people that you really want to hear from.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun, and I could really talk to you guys a lot more about this. I hope we'll get to talk about it again. Thanks for making time for this.
Thank you. This was a pleasure. It's so nice to revisit some of our early years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.